As a forewarning, before we begin today's episode, please be advised that the following content may contain details of disturbing events, including violence and other sensitive topics, which some listeners may find difficult or triggering. Listener discretion is advised. Thank you. Hi, Night Watchers. Welcome back. I'm your host, Haley, and today we bring you the tragic and ultimately infuriating case of Britanee Drexel, a disappearance that cast a dark shadow over a popular vacation destination and was, years later, revealed to be a brutal murder. Let's begin. Now, this case hits close to home for me, as it takes place in the heart of downtown Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. My family has been traveling to this particular stretch of the Grand Strand for as long as I can vividly remember. We actually prefer the slightly quieter atmosphere of North Myrtle Beach, which possesses a distinctively different scene and a more relaxed vibe compared to the often crowded and energetic Myrtle Beach proper. However, the disappearance of Britanee Drexel is a case that has always stuck with me, particularly given how close I was in age to her when I first heard the initial terrifying news of her vanishing, and considering the devastating events unfolding in a place that's so familiar. It underscores the chilling reality that tragedy can strike anywhere, even in places associated with leisure and escape. Now, let's continue to unravel the agonizing details of this heartbreaking case. Britanee Drexel was just 17 years old, a young woman on the cusp of adulthood, when she vanished on April 25, 2009, while on what should have been a carefree spring break trip to Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. She was visiting some fellow friends from school, having made the journey from her home in chilly New York. What began as a seemingly typical spring break getaway with friends took a dark and sinister turn, ultimately evolving into a protracted and emotionally draining murder inquiry that will leave a community searching for answers for over a decade. One of the most poignant and perhaps regret-laden details for Britanee's family is the fact that she actually lied to her mother Dawn about where she was going for spring break. Now, it's important to know that Britanee initially told Dawn that she would be traveling to Florida, hoping this destination would be perceived as safer and thus more likely to gain her mother's approval. Dawn, however, harbored reservations about Britanee, who was younger than the friends she intended to travel with, going to a potentially unsupervised environment. Despite Dawn's initial reluctance in expressing concerns about her daughter's safety while traveling solely with upperclassmen, Britanee persistently pleaded for permission to join her friends. Ultimately, Dawn relented, unaware that Britanee and her friends were actually heading to Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, a well-known and often rowdy spring break hotspot. This initial deception adds a layer of heartbreaking irony to the unfolding tragedy of the story. After being in Myrtle Beach for just 2 days, the events began to take a more sinister turn. Following a minor interpersonal conflict with her boyfriend John Greco, reports suggest it was a relatively minor disagreement, the kind common in teenage relationships. The two maintained communicate via text message, however. On the evening of April 25th at approximately 8:00 p.m., Britanee departed her friends at the Bar Harbor Hotel situated on the beachfront. Now, after reading several news articles, it appears that Britanee was feeling kind of left out by her other friends. Given they were upperclassmen, it seemed like they were interested in doing different things and Britanee wanted to do something else, so it seemed like they all kind of got into somewhat of a scuffle, not really quite an argument, and Britanee decided that she was going to go see a friend that she knew had moved down to Myrtle Beach from their home in chilly New York. So her intention was to walk roughly 1.5 miles south along South Ocean Boulevard, a busy thoroughfare even in the evening, to visit a friend residing at the Blue Water Resort. Security surveillance at the resort documented her arrival. Britanee was carrying a beige purse and was dressed in a black and white tank top, flip-flops, and shorts, typical spring break attire. Subsequent surveillance footage captured her departure from the Blue Water Resort at approximately 8:45 p.m. Now remember, this was the resort that her other friend was staying at, not the one that she had initially booked a room at when she got to Myrtle Beach. Subsequent to leaving the Blue Water Resort, Brittanee continued her text message exchange with John Greco. However, at approximately 9:15 p.m., all communication abruptly ceased. The digital silence was an immediate red flag to everyone. When John realized that something was wrong, a growing unease setting in, he immediately called Brittanee's mother, Dawn. Now remember, Dawn was under the impression her daughter was in Florida and had no idea she was actually in Myrtle Beach. Shocked and utterly confused by this revelation of her true location and the alarming news of Brittanee's sudden disappearance, Dawn immediately contacted police and authorities back home in New York. They instructed her to head down to South Carolina without delay and get directly involved with the local authorities who had jurisdiction. So Dawn contacted Brittanee's father, and it's important to know that Brittanee's parents were no longer married, they were actually divorced. But Dawn and Brittanee's father both went down to Myrtle Beach so they could work with officials there. The investigation into Brittanee's disappearance took many twists and turns over the years. One individual who became significantly entangled in the case was Timothy Deshawn Taylor. In 2016, approximately 7 years after Brittaneee vanished, a jailhouse informant came forward with disturbing allegations. This informant claimed to have witnessed Taylor and others sexually assault and then murder Brittaneee at a stash house shortly after her disappearance in 2009, alleging they then disposed of her body. Now, this stash house was reportedly in Georgetown, South Carolina, which is almost an hour away from Myrtle Beach, where Brittaneee was originally staying. Now, Brittanee's case had sort of gone cold since the night that she initially went missing, and the investigation into Brittanee's disappearance took many twists and turns over the years. One individual who became significantly entangled in the case was Timothy Deshawn Taylor. In 2016, approximately 7 years after Brittaneee vanished, a jailhouse informant came forward with disturbing allegations. This informant claimed to have witnessed Taylor and others sexually assault and then murder Brittaneee at a stash house shortly after her disappearance in 2009, alleging they then disposed of her body. Now, this stash house was supposedly in Georgetown, South Carolina, which is almost an hour from Myrtle Beach. And based on this information, the FBI dedicated considerable investigative resources towards Taylor. However, Timothy Taylor consistently and vehemently denied any involvement in Brittanee's disappearance and murder. In an effort to clear his name, Taylor even agreed to take a polygraph test in 2017. While the FBI stated that the results of this polygraph indicated some deceptive answers regarding his knowledge of the case and how he knew Brittaneee, Taylor maintained that the only information he possessed was overhearing an argument among a group of people about who had Brittanee's cell phone. Ultimately, despite the informant's claims in the polygraph results, no criminal charges were ever filed against Timothy Deshawn Taylor in connection with the disappearance and murder of Britanee Drexel, and he has continued to assert his innocence almost a decade later today. However, the search for the truth finally yielded a breakthrough in May of 2022. Raymond Moody, a 62-year-old registered sex offender with a prior criminal history, turned himself in to the Georgetown County Sheriff's Office on an obstruction of justice charge. It's crucial to note that law enforcement had identified Moody as a person of interest in Brittanee's baffling disappearance as early as 2012, his name having circulated within investigative circles for a decade prior to his confession. In a chilling turn of events, Moody confessed to his involvement in Brittanee's fate, and in a move that finally offered a potential path to closure, provided investigators with the location of where her remains might be found. Acting swiftly on this crucial information, the FBI meticulously excavated the specific site over the course of the next 3 days. Their efforts focused on a wooded area off a gated private drive outside of Georgetown, approximately 4 feet beneath the surface. By May 11th, their grim search yielded a heartbreaking discovery. Human remains were located. On May 15th, the agonizing wait for confirmation ended when those remains were positively identified as belonging to Britanee Drexel through conclusive DNA analysis and dental records, bringing a devastating yet definitive answer to the years of uncertainty. The tragic truth was finally and irrevocably revealed. Britanee Drexel had been strangled and then buried in that secluded location by the morning of April 26, 2009, the day after she vanished from Myrtle Beach. Now, this is where I ask the question, if officials believed that Ray Moody was one of their person of interest dating all the way back to her disappearance in 2012, what stopped them from pursuing this idea? And why was he even a person of interest to begin with? I think that this is where investigators sort of dropped the ball in Brittanee's case, and I feel like they could have had answers a little bit sooner and maybe could have prevented from wasting a bit of time with Deshaun Taylor's inaccurate and false statements, which kind of sent them on a wild goose chase in Brittanee's search. However, after 13 long and torturous years, characterized by unimaginable uncertainty, relentless searching by her devoted family, and the frustrating navigation of false leads, there was finally a degree of closure with the identification of Brittanee's remains. Though the profound pain of such a devastating loss remains unimaginable for those who loved her, the vibrant young woman who embarked on a spring break trip full of the promise of youth never returned home to her family in New York, becoming the victim of a senseless and horrific act of violence that extinguished her bright future. Thank you all for joining me on Nightwatch as we explore the tragic journey to the truth in the murder of Britanee Drexel. The fight for justice, even when it spans over a decade and involves navigating layers of deception, can ultimately bring answers, though those answers may be deeply heartbreaking. As always, feel free to leave a comment in the show notes with any thoughts that you had from the episode. And always remember that if you want to investigate these sources on your own, I've also linked several sources that helped get the information from this episode. That brings us to the end of today's episode on Nightwatch. As we move into our special summer series, we want to hear from you, Night Watchers. What cases have kept you up at night? What mysteries do you want us to unravel? Head on over to our social media where you'll find all the links in the show notes and submit your ideas for upcoming episodes. But that's not all. As a special thank you for your engagement this summer, one lucky listener will have the incredible opportunity to join me right here on Nightwatch as a guest speaker to discuss their chosen case. Imagine sharing your insights and your theories with our entire audience. So, get those true crime gears turning, send us your most compelling cases, and you could be joining me behind the mic. Until next time, Night Watchers, keep watching the night. See you guys next week, and don't forget to submit your ideas.